Welcome to another episode of Tank Talks, your personal think tank for all things startups and venture capital. I'm your host, Matt Cohen, founder and managing partner at Ripple Ventures. On today's show, we are talking with our newest venture partner at Ripple Ventures, Mike Silagadze, and his journey of starting and scaling TopHat into one of the most successful EdTech platforms in the world. We asked Mike about his experience raising capital from Canadian investors back in 2010, and then going on to raise over $150 million several years later from some of the greatest venture investors. We get Mike to explain how extremely important it is for startup founders to think about pivoting their go-to-market strategy early on to help figure out product market fit better. We also dig into TopHat's M&A strategy and Mike's advice on when it makes sense for startups to be considering acquiring competitors as a path of growth. Finally, we get into why Mike decided to come join us at Ripple Ventures as our first venture partner in helping us be the best early stage venture fund for founders by offering his valuable time to help Ripple's portfolio companies. But before we get started today, I wanted to share a personal message about my own experiences when setting up Ripple Ventures' first fund in 2018 that may resonate with some of our listeners. I often speak with other first-time fund managers about their fears and frustrations when it comes to launching your first fund, and the conversation always leads to how I managed to deal with all the administrative hassles that arise when running an investment fund. This is where the team at Adoro Advisors comes into the story. I was lucky enough to meet the founder of Adoro, Bram Ricky, at a VC networking event in New York City at the exact time when I was struggling with my own back office headaches. As soon as Bram told me he had launched Adoro as a tech-first, high-touch fund administrator for emerging managers, I was completely sold. But to provide me with more comfort, Bram mentioned he was previously the former CFO of True Ventures, an extremely successful Valley-based venture fund, which he had left to start Adoro after so many new fund managers were asking for his advice on fund administration. Since my very first interaction with the team at Adoro, all my fund administration tasks have been a breeze. They are the perfect partner for any emerging manager like myself when it comes to supporting you through those initial Fund 1 frustrations. From managing capital calls to LP documentation, all the way to budgets, tax documents, and anything in between, the team at Adoro literally does it all. That is why I'm excited to welcome Adoro as an official partner to Ripple Ventures and now Tank Talks, so other emerging managers can share in the benefits that I've been so fortunate to experience throughout my time as a venture investor. Don't just take it from me, Adoro works with top-tier managers like Lowercase Capital, Homebrew, and Craft Ventures as well. Through their internally developed technology platform called Fund Panel, fund managers and their LPs can access all things fund-related anytime. Listeners of Tank Talks can receive a demo by emailing dev@adoroadvisors.com. That's DEV@adoroadvisors.com and mentioning Tank Talks to get set up today. Now let's get into this week's episode with Mike Silagadze, co-founder and CEO of TopHat. Thanks everyone for joining us for our next Ripple Ventures Tank Talk with Mike Silagadze from TopHat to discuss the real truth about building a startup. And this is a special one for me because Mike has been a friend over the last couple of years that has now officially joined Ripple Ventures as our first venture partner. I really want to get back to the sort of the very beginning. When you started it, I've heard that you had to actually max out your credit cards, use your line of credits, which was probably often the case for a lot of founders, before raising your first investment round of $200,000, which I think took you around 6 months to do as well. You know, what kept you going during those early days instead of just giving up like some entrepreneurs do?
It was definitely a different time for a number of reasons. One, the economy was not even recovering, was still suffering from the great financial crisis and the recession. There really wasn't a startup ecosystem at the time in Canada, so there just weren't that many investors that were active. And then even broadly, I think doing a startup was a lot less accepted, I guess, versus today. So that made it difficult. I think there's pros and cons to being in a different environment today for entrepreneurs where I would say it's far easier to raise capital, and the advice and best practices about what to do, what not to do is much more broadly available, which is fantastic. But at the same time, that makes the space a lot more crowded. So I'd say there's pros and cons. Now, in those early days, when things were really difficult, time having to fund it with basically whatever debt the bank would throw at me. There were definitely some dark periods, and I think that every entrepreneur at some point goes through that, and it's hard to say what keeps you going. I think not really having a parachute, not really having another option is probably the most honest answer I could give. If I had another job that I could go go back to. I mean, I didn't. I had just graduated. If I had some sort of safety net, then maybe I would have given up. I don't know. It's hard to say, but I didn't, and so it was basically just keep pushing through until everything explodes, or you figure out a way to make it work.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say back then, obviously after the crisis, there was like a lot of picking up the pieces for people trying to figure out their next steps in their lives. But it's very different now with so much capital in the system to say that the persistence is there with founders when they don't have that mortgage on their house, that increased line of credit knocking on their door every day. I wonder if what we're seeing now, and we can talk about this later, but what we're seeing now with founders raising capital so easily is going to be the same tenacity and persistence that you had to go through when you were starting, because there wasn't that capital and therefore you had to go through that line of credit journey and mortgage. People have always said to me, if you want to find a way to make yourself work harder, put a mortgage on your house. Nothing will make you work harder than doing that to yourself. And we'll see what this ends up looking like, but it's interesting to hear that's what motivated you by having that sort of vicious cycle of, okay, I need to pay off this line of credit next month, and then I got to retake it down to keep funding the company. So it took you 6 months to raise the 200,000. What were those first investors like? And what was that experience of actually taking in that initial capital, feeling like you had something to build on?
Again, putting the sort of backdrop of the crisis, there really weren't very many people that were, at all interested in making startup investing. So the result was that we basically pitched, anybody who would give us the time of day. Random, bank executives and lawyers, and basically anybody who could write maybe a 20, 25K check. We tried to pitch them on TopHat. I think we ended up doing over 60 pitches before we were able to close that first round of financing. It was really, really challenging, and certainly required a lot of perseverance to try and get through it. The first investors that were willing to kind of take a bet on us, it was two folks from Waterloo, Mike Stork and Larry Innanen. They had made lots of angel investments before. They were, two of the more active investors in the community in Waterloo. And I think, in many ways, understandably, they were pretty skeptical about TopHat. They looked at, myself, my co-founder. We didn't have any experience. I don't think we looked particularly impressive. We didn't have any of the business chops. Or track record. So understandably, that gave them some skepticism. And, and furthermore, we were doing something in the education space, which is, one of the hardest categories to try and compete in. So the combination of those things, I think, made it particularly hard for us. And interestingly, and I've told this story a couple of times before, but the ultimate reason they ended up investing in us wasn't even necessarily because they, some of the things that I just mentioned, but it was because I demonstrated some high degree of tenacity. In coming to the pitch meeting with those investors, I actually ended up getting into a car accident and destroyed my car. It was pretty bad, and as a result of the car accident, I actually ended up being a bit late to the pitch meeting. And I think I said something. Frankly, I don't recall say anything, but I think they told me later on that I said something like, "Hey, sorry, I just got in a horrible car crash, almost died, but hey, forget that. Let me tell you about TopHat." And they looked at that and said, "All right, look, this idea is kind of kooky. The founders have no experience, and they're not that impressive, but like clearly there's some level of perseverance and tenacity there that." It's going to make it more likely that they succeed. And that, they told me later on, years later, that was the reason they decided to take a bet on us.
Wow, I did not actually hear that story, but that's incredible. It sounds like you walked through fire as well on the way to the meeting, and you still made it there to pitch them on TopHat, which is incredible. But what was the initial feedback that investors were giving you that you received? That you had to prove them wrong, the ones who weren't interested at the time. What was that kind of feedback like that you had to prove them wrong on?
It's amazing how much of a difference, like you can have two identical companies that are doing the same thing, and maybe one of them is even, has a better product or is approaching things maybe in a somewhat better way, but they're pitching it, the way they're telling the story is just not as compelling, as effective. It's not painting the big vision. And then the other company maybe that's less good is doing a better job of telling the story. Maybe their pitch is just a little bit tighter. Their founder is more compelling, more charismatic, and that's going to make all the difference. Honestly, like a lot of times you've got a charismatic founder that is able to really like compel an audience. That'll get them that first angel check. So for us, like I think, frankly, if I look back at that time, I just don't think we were very compelling. I don't think we were very impressive for a lot of reasons. But at least to some extent, because the sort of knowledge of what it looks, what a good pitch looks like, what the sort of pattern recognition that some investors use to identify good founders, that just wasn't widespread. So we just didn't know. So I think our vision was too small. We were very kind of in some ways technical and like very tactically oriented rather than painting the big vision. So I think that's really what made it difficult for us, or at least one of the things that made it difficult for us to raise the financing. And then in addition to that, on top of everything, education, very tough space. Every investor kind of looked at that and said, "Oh, are you really going to be able to make it?" And then we didn't, I don't think we knew enough to know how hard a space it was. I mean, we just sort of thought we had a cool product and a good idea and something that could solve a problem for people. And so we just, went at it. We didn't really do a deep market analysis to understand that, whether this was going to work or not.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say how important the storytelling part is when raising money at the early stage, because even now when we see a great storyteller pitch a company, we also have to separate that storytelling aspect from, is this a good venture investment? And, I'd have to ask you, looking back now, would you have invested in your company knowing all the troubles you had to go through to get to where you ended up as a venture investor? Or did you think like,
no way,
just hearing yourself pitch, right?
Not even just, I mean, yeah, it's a really tough space, look, and maybe I don't give myself enough credit. I don't know. But yeah, it's a really tough space. The idea is interesting and kind of quirky, I guess, when you first hear it. So maybe that would have been something that would have kind of, there's definitely a period from sort of zero to probably even the first year where I think I probably could confidently say that I would not have invested in myself. After that, I think I would have. The reason is just because we had traction. Very early on, we got customers, we got revenue. We came up with what I think is a pretty clever revenue model and a twist on the market, showing clearly we could execute with basically no resources. So at that point, I think that would have been different. And that's when I talk to investors that came in later, those are the things they point to say, look, you basically, the team showed that they could figure it out and get something going. So yeah, there's probably that dividing line there.
Yeah, but let's double click on how you got that early traction, because it didn't come that easy. As I've heard you say, you stated that changing the go-to-market strategy at the early stage is extremely important for startups, and you had to do that several times. So how should founders think about pivoting their go-to-market strategy early on to get quicker product market fit like you guys had to at TopHat?
Yeah, so I think one of the things I don't hear talked about enough, because it's just a really important point. People talk a lot about things like the Paul Graham quote, "Make something people want." That's very accurate. And people talk about developing the right go-to-market and product market fit and things like that. But one aspect of it I think is not talked about enough is making sure that you've got the right customer, because you can have a great product and a great market and a great team, but if you don't nail like who your actual customer is and what are their needs, then it's very easy to go down the wrong path for a long time. And that sounds straightforward, but it really isn't, because in any given company, in any given sector, like if you're making HR software or education software, in our case, you can have any number of customers. You can have in our case, you could have the university CIO as a customer. You could have the university provost as a customer. You could have students as a customer or a professor as a customer. And in every one of those things, you can say, okay, I'm building, let's say largely the same piece of software in the same category. But depending on who your customer is, that's going to determine whether you've got a viable business or not. So in the exact same way, if you say, okay, I'm selling to the head of HR, or I'm selling to the CEO, or I'm selling to the head of sales, completely different businesses. Arguably, you could have the same, employee engagement product or whatever you want. So really figuring out like who is the right customer and where is the biggest opportunity, who has the biggest pain, who has the budget to be able to spend on it, is something that I don't hear founders and advisors talking about enough. So for us, our initial idea or initial thought was that our customer would be the university administration, like the CIO or the provost. Fairly quickly, and give ourselves some credit for this. Fairly quickly, we realized like that was a dead end. I mean, it wasn't going to work because although in theory we had this product for student engagement that would potentially serve some of their needs, it just wasn't a big enough problem for that buyer, and so we needed to pivot. Our pivot really was not a product pivot, although obviously it influenced the direction of the roadmap. Our pivot was really changing who the buyer is. And when we changed it to the professor, a lot of stuff kind of naturally came out of that because, it naturally sort of said, okay, well, if the professor is our buyer, well, okay, what's our revenue model? Well, typically, if the professor is the buyer, it's a student paid model because students are, buy courseware for any given course. In terms of the functionality and, the features that we want to build, again, that naturally came out of, okay, what are the challenges that the teacher is having? So that's certainly one of the challenges that we went through in the early days. And I think we were able to overcome it.
No, you guys did a fantastic job. And we talk about this a lot at Ripple as well. And I hope you've heard us say it in, the meetings we've had with you and companies, is that separating the users versus the buyers is the first thing you have to do when deciding on your go-to-market, and then honing in on which ones can be the best buyers for your solution without changing the solution. So really, it's just changing the go-to-market strategy on who you're targeting. Because a lot of people sometimes focus on their users too early and think they are the buyers, but really they are not. And some people focus too much on the buyers who don't really care about how the product is being used. And so isolating those separately and then focusing in on the one person that can be the buyer and also understand the ROI to the users is the best way to get your go-to-market strategy, I think, quickest to market, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. That's a good way of breaking it down.
Now, what about product market fit? Because we talk about this as well. Some people say, okay, you have product solution fit, but you don't have product market fit. And then other people say you should always be chasing product market fit. You should never stay stagnant with it. What were your thoughts about that at TopHat?
I don't think that we were that methodical about it, honestly. But I guess, to some degree, we put that into practice because we kept all of these problems tend to naturally take care of themselves if you just spend a lot of time talking to customers and stay really close to the ground. Don't forget that, like, in the end, someone's going to buy what you're selling. So I think maybe intuitively, implicitly, we thought about those types of things. I don't know that explicitly we ever did that kind of rigorous analysis, but hey, maybe it would have helped us.
No, it sounds like you did the research part with customers very often to really understand what their needs were and didn't stay like stagnant with it after you did the first batch of research, I guess is what I hear you saying. One thing that has always stuck with me was when we had our very first Tank Talks, which we used to actually host them in our incubator space in downtown Toronto called The Tank. You came in and did a conversation with our founders and talked about some of the incredible insights that you had learned along the way. And one of the things that stuck with me from that important conversation to our CEOs was how they should be keeping their data rooms up to date, even when they're not fundraising. I remember you mentioned that you were raising one of your later stage rounds. I think it was your Series C round led by Union Square. And the amount of detail those investors dug up in your CRM and your user data was incredible. You mentioned something about how they pinpointed one customer's specific quarterly revenue numbers that were way off out of the thousands of paying customers that you had. And they were asking you specifically, why did this one customer miss? That is something that has stuck with me and that we share with all of our portfolio companies. And we do get pushback on it saying, why do I need to update my data room on a quarterly basis? We just finished raising our A. We probably won't raise our B for another year or two. But it is something that you obviously thought about and experienced yourself. So why do you think it's so important for founders? And how do you think they should think about it differently as more of an advantageous thing rather than an onerous thing to them?
I mean, there's definitely a balance there. The amount of work it takes to put together a complete data room for a fundraise is significant. I mean, especially at the later stages, you're talking about hundreds of hours of work at least across basically every team in the company. so it's hard to, I think, have a complete set of data that you can just go out and raise money with. Keeping a combination of a business model that's up to date with like forecasts, actuals, just the model that describes how your business operates, and a set of dashboards that ideally are auto updating based on product data that you're feeding into it, that you use in your day-to-day reporting, your day-to-day operating cadence. That is really valuable because that ensures that internally within the business you can have a sort of a quarterly cadence, or even ideally, I would even say a weekly cadence of being really on top of your metrics and making sure the moment something goes off track, or identify the moment you see an opportunity in a particular domain, you can react to that very quickly. So that keeping a set of books that are up to date and really good shape helps you with that, and it's just good operating cadence. But when you go out and do the raise, at later stages, you're definitely still going to have to put in an unfortunate amount of work to get it across the finish line.
Right. I mean, it makes perfect sense. You're using the data to make decisions on your business on a day-to-day basis, which then can be translated into your data room. So it's not like additional work, it's just transfer of work. But we tell our founders, the reason we ask for monthly updates is not because we want them to be annoying, but we want it to be a great way for you to develop the pattern recognition and the habits of setting up a data-driven enterprise. So you want to be able to have the dashboards and there's so many tools now that you can use to collect all this information out of, your CRM, out of your GitHub, out of your project management tools. There's so many different things that have dashboard capabilities that it's way less work now than it probably was for your team back then. But it's just a great way to drive the business forward using data rather than just sort of anecdotes of, oh, this month was better than the last month. Great. A lot of fluff around those monthly updates sometimes you see without focusing on the data. So I just recognize that as one thing you stuck with. Another thing you mentioned during that original Tank Talk was that I think you said you received an investment from Emergence Capital, which was from the same fund that had invested in Zoom and maybe a few other multi-fund returners. So one, that's hilarious. Two, you were an incredible company, but you had to kind of live a bit in the shadows of the Zooms of the world. What was it like being part of such an iconic group of fellow portfolio companies? And did you ever get a chance to connect with some of the other founders from other portfolio companies?
Yeah, that's certainly one of the benefits of having great investors is you get that network of other portfolio companies, other companies in their network to be able to learn from them. And so that was extremely valuable. I don't know that it necessarily or in any direct way impacted our interactions with Emergence or our other investors. I think it was more something that we thought about ourselves and had in the back of our mind. To their credit, Emergence didn't treat us any differently than any other portfolio company, or wasn't at all hesitant with giving their time to support the business.
That's fantastic. I mean, if you didn't have to be the one fund maker, the pressure of that, I guess, is what you didn't have to experience because they already had such amazing outcomes from that existing portfolio. Another thing that you had done recently is you've done a handful of M&A deals in the last few years, but as the acquirer. What was that experience like? And when do you think it makes sense for some startups to be considering that path of growth, the buy or build mentality?
Yeah, that's been a really interesting experience over the last 2 years for me, because being on the other side of the table as an acquirer, it's very different, and you get to really see and understand kind of the dynamics of how an acquisition kind of comes together. What are all the things that can make or break it? There are three reasons. I mean, this is, let's say, loosely correct. There are three types of acquisitions. And you can have an acquisition that's a combination of these things. The first is when you're buying a technology, like a product, that you don't have the bandwidth or the ability to build it, or the time horizon to build it. So you want to bring in a particular technology. The second is you're buying a team where there's a particular team with a skill set, and you want to bring them in and have them work on something internal. Finally, buying customers. So you've got maybe a technology that you're going to sunset, and a team that's good, and you're just going to distribute them within your own company. but primarily you're going to buy the customers. Depending on which of those it is, it's a very different acquisition. The company that's being acquired has a very sort of different leverage in negotiating. And the price point, I would say, is more or less certain, I guess, depending on which it is. For us, and I would say for me personally, the latter most type of acquisition is always felt like the most, the least likely to fall apart. Because when you're buying a product, 100% of the time you underestimate how difficult it's going to be to integrate, and oftentimes you never integrate it, and you have to rebuild it from scratch anyway. So it's really hard to do that right. With the team, same thing. Look, when somebody's getting a very large check, they're basically going to say anything. Everybody wants to, tells you how passionate they are about your mission and how they want to stick around and help you build it for the next 50 years. But the reality, as soon as that check clears, the reality is oftentimes different. Very, very few companies are good at actually acquiring and integrating teams. Most companies are terrible at it, and you lose the entire team very quickly. Whereas when you're buying customers, it's like buying dollars with dollars, right? As long as you do a good job of migrating those customers onto your platform or maintaining them or whatever you want to do, or doing cross-selling, upselling, those are things that I find a little bit more predictable. And so those are the acquisitions that we did. I mean, for all intents and purposes, we bought customers. And the teams stuck around, and the products were able to be migrated in the case of our acquisitions to our platform. And pretty much in every way, it's worked out, as well or better than we had anticipated. So that's been great. I mean, it's been a really great experience for us, and it's a new muscle that we've built within the business.
That's amazing. Yeah, I completely agree. I think if you're kind of at the growth stage of a business, going out and buying product and team is going to be a lot more distracting than bolting on more additional revenue, which is always helpful at the sort of earlier growth stage. But the later, multi-billion, trillion-dollar companies like Google and Apple and Salesforce, they're so used to buying teams and product because one, the revenue they're typically buying doesn't make a difference to them in the grand scheme of things. And so they've set up whole divisions to acquire and then onboard those teammates to make sure they have a successful transition. That's part of their job, is to make sure that those product and team purchases get fully engulfed into the Salesforce or Google ecosystem. Whereas I assume TopHat hasn't really had to build out that infrastructure, that muscle yet on integrating teams and product as well, or as easy as it is to acquire revenue. Is that the case?
Mm-hmm. We're probably not as mature as we could be, but I think we've gotten pretty good at it. I mean, the fact that we've had 3 successful ones now is a good sign that we were able to do something right there. But the main reason that companies like Google is very different than Salesforce, I think. Google's investment thesis seems to be more like maybe a venture fund is the best way to describe it, where they buy a lot of companies. Most of them don't work out, but the few hits, like Google Docs and YouTube and others, just pay for the rest of it. I mean, that's pretty much how they run their business as well. As they just, the cliche with Google is you're constantly going from one failed project to another, and they just create so much surplus from the products that do work that it pays for everything else. Salesforce, I think, is a very different beast. I mean, they've certainly had their share of failed acquisitions where they paid, I don't know, $50, $100 million for a business that just literally went to zero. But in most of their acquisitions, including the more high profile ones, I mean, I would say it's much closer to what we did, where they're buying revenue and customers and doing the cross-sell, upsell thing. They bought their marketing cloud, and then they basically take their massive sales team, go out there and just push marketing cloud into every one of their customers. And now that, Salesforce owns it, the inbound and ability to generate revenue, with the marketing cloud Pardot got accelerated. And so the business grew substantially. And there's a bit of a multiple arbitrage there that they're playing where they're valued at, I don't know, whatever it is these days, 10, 20 times revenues. And if they can buy a company at, let's say, a fraction of that, 7 times revenues, pretty much on day one, you're getting an uplift. And, a significant amount of Salesforce growth, I don't know the exact numbers on this, but more than half has come from exactly the strategy of just buying companies, bolting them on, cross sell, upsell, rinse and repeat. Oracle has been doing this for, like half a century now or something, and many others. So that this is a very like standard playbook model. When you're a company that's flying high and you've got a great multiple in the markets, just like keep bolting stuff on and building a larger and larger sort of beast. There's obviously downsides to that. Like downside is eventually you become Oracle. But I'm sure Mark Benioff is spending time thinking about how does he avoid becoming Oracle at some point, and getting into a stagnation phase where your valuation is basically flat or declining.
What are your thoughts on startups engaging an advisor or an M&A investment banker if they already have existing relationships with those potential acquirers? Is it a good idea to put them into the mix and help them run the process, or should you negotiate on your own behalf with the sales force directly? What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know that I've ever seen bankers do anything good. It's certainly helpful to have advice, and you can get advice oftentimes for free. You don't need to pay someone 5% of the transaction. And frankly, I've seen bankers screw up more deals than support them. If you're running a process, if you think, okay, we're going to run a process, we're going to, we have inbound interest, and okay, we need to run a process and try and make a deal happen. It's frankly just not that hard to do that yourself. You don't need to, again, pay a banker who in most cases is not going to add that much value. Like, in most cases, what the banker does is they make a phone call and they bring someone to the table, and then they're somewhere between useless and harmful, because they're usually sales guys. I mean, this is what like many people don't have this like concept in their mind that like an investment banker is a sales guy. That is what they do. They basically sell equity for the most part. They're typically not super sophisticated. They're not like looking into the details of your unit economics of your business. They're a sales guy that will give a high level pitch and book a meeting for you, and then 99% of the work has to be done by you and your team. So then the question is, okay, is it really that hard to just go and for you to map out, who are the potential buyers, reach out to the heads of corp dev or the CEOs? Frankly, that's probably a lot better. Reach out directly to the CEO through a warm, intro through one of your investors, and then start that conversation. It sounds intimidating, it sounds scary, but frankly, once you do it, it's just not that hard. As I said, to reiterate, I've seen bankers screw up a lot more deals than make them happen. So you're better off trying to run your own process and focusing on it. But look, for most companies, I mean, M&A deals, for every one that's sort of one potential acquisition offer that sort of pops up, maybe 1 in 10 will actually end up going through. So it can be a huge distraction. In most cases, it's a mistake to even engage. In most cases, just focus on building your business and making it more valuable. If at some point you just feel like it's the right time to sell, then you need to sort of put your energy into it and say, okay, we're going to sell. Let's run a process. Let's be methodical about it. But if you're just in the midst of running your business, you're growing, things are good, taking random inbound M&A interest meetings is usually just a distraction and a waste of time, and it can do a lot more harm than good, frankly, both to you and to your team. I guess if you start going down the path and then inevitably one of these things falls through.
Interesting. I appreciate your honesty. I mean, we just lost all of our investment banker listeners and sponsorships, but that's fine. Don't worry about that. In Canada, we've been known to be great at building startups, but have been struggling at building those large growth companies. However, TopHat and several others have broken through that barrier. But I got to ask you, did you ever consider selling early on, like most startups here in Canada? And if so, what stopped you?
I don't know. I mean, we had like most companies that are having any amount of success, we had sort of soft pokes in terms of M&A. Never really pursued them that aggressively. So short answer is no. We were always focused on kind of the long term and building a business. I mean, as long as you've got your revenues and customers that like you and you're growing, that's going to create a lot more value than anything else you could be doing.
Wow. Well, I'm sure everyone is happy that you decided to keep your heads down and focus because you built something incredible. And after a decade of building and scaling TopHat, you're now getting ready to officially hang up your top hat. no pun intended, title as the CEO, but will continue to stay on the board and plan to work on some side projects, including joining us at Ripple Ventures as our newest venture partner, something I'm personally extremely excited about and very appreciative of. Can you share what made you want to give back to other founders and startups who just are starting out on their entrepreneurial journey and joining us at Ripple?
Yeah, so I think, look, it's something that I've been doing for a while, even while running TopHat. I mean, I various sort of mentoring and startup advising activities with Techstars and Founder Institute and here in Toronto. So it's something I've always found both rewarding and there's a bit of a feeling of moral obligation. Startups are very fraught with risk. You can control your destiny to a great extent, but the scale of your success and sometimes it's entirely possible that you can do all the right things and still fail. With that said, the ones of us that have to some degree benefited from the sort of stochastic process that generates successful startups, have this moral obligation to go out and help others who are going through the same journey. I think it's the right thing to do. So whenever a founder reaches out, I have a policy of basically 100% of the time taking an hour here and there to support folks and give advice or make introductions or whatever I can do. I think it's just the right thing to do.
Well, we appreciate that, and it sounds like you really believe in the ripple effect too, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. And so then we've had lots of good interactions and. I really like what you guys are doing. So I mean, it was a pretty easy decision to come on board and help out in whatever I can.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that, as I said. And the other thing too is that when I started out as an angel investor, I didn't have anyone as a relationship in the venture community that I could rely on. And having someone who's gone through the venture investment journey to be partnered with as an angel investor you are yourself, I just think helps bring a different set of eyes to a deal where you could be a good angel investor, but having a venture lens on it could also help at the early stage. And then vice versa. Us as a venture fund may be missing a lot of great opportunities because we look at it too much like a venture investment where you can bring a lot of that angel mindset to a potential opportunity. And I think that's what makes it so valuable for both of us. So thank you for that. Now, I have to ask you, it's been a decade since you started TopHat. The Canadian venture ecosystem has changed dramatically. What have you noticed the biggest changes are so far in the last couple of years since when you started TopHat a decade ago?
Well, for one thing, there actually is a startup ecosystem. I mean, I think when we were starting out, it was sort of a rounding error, I guess, on the world stage. Whereas now, I mean, Toronto's a pretty serious contender. Certainly a good tier 2 startup city, which is great. I mean, there's not a lot of those out there. Yeah, so that's a huge change. I mean, there's a ton of great companies now. There's investors, from all over the world that are pouring money into Toronto. There's companies that are seeing the advantages of the Toronto ecosystem and they're opening up offices here. And now that obviously the pandemic shifted people's perspective on remote work, we're seeing even more demand kind of flooding into the ecosystem, and we're seeing salaries and the competition for talent reach new heights that I think, I thought it was crazy last year, but it seems even more crazy this year. So, and these are all positive things. I think in the grand scheme of things, these are all really good things for the ecosystem. It makes it easier to start companies and build big businesses in Canada.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the remote part because I was going to ask you about that. TopHat, as I understand, is a predominantly Toronto-based company. What do you think about building a remote first company now? And do you think if you were to start TopHat today, would you be a remote first company or still an in-office culture starting out?
I think there are a lot of advantages to being in the same office. Clearly, it's possible to build large businesses remote first, and many companies are going down that path. Everyone has benefited. All these companies that are going remote first, most of these companies that are going remote first, were built, in an office sort of centric model, and so they are benefiting from the culture, the dynamics, the interactions, just the knowledge, the organization memory that exists. That was to a large extent built around having everybody in the same space and a lot of those sort of serendipitous interactions in the office. And when you on a dime sort of shift to being remote, it feels like, oh yeah, things are fine, but it's because you're benefiting from that legacy, I guess, the way the company was originally built. The question is, are you going to be able to maintain that, as like 20, 30, 40, 50% of your employees, join remote first? I think we're seeing retention rates taking a dip all across, everywhere. And I think to some extent it's because of that, because right now, for an employee to leave a company, they just close their laptop, open a new one, and there we go. They're at their new office. Like, it's just, they don't have that personal connection with their fellow employees. So I think it's tricky. So I have some particular opinions around, like, what are the ways to do it well and ways to not do it well. But in the end, I don't think anybody's got the answers at this point.
Yeah, 100% agree. I mean, you just said it. It's if it's so easy to hire someone remote, it's also so easy to lose someone because they're remote. You can literally put someone onto the team one day, and at the end of that week, if they don't like it, there's no connection to the physical people in the office, the culture. They can close that laptop and open a new one the next Monday. So there's a risk reward that you have to think about by being fully remote versus maybe a hybrid option that a lot of companies that we talk to are considering right now. So let's change things up a little bit. You and I, we talk very often about a bunch of things going on in the ecosystem, but I know you are very passionate and excited about the future of blockchain, especially DeFi. So I would love to hear, some of the greatest opportunities that you see out there, one for venture investments, but just investments in general in the DeFi space and why you're so excited about it.
Yeah, so I mean, I have to be somewhat careful. I mean, I'm still full time at TopHat, and that is my day job. But yes, on the side, I'm spending a lot of time thinking about and investing in the crypto space. I think that if you sort of draw the line from 2009, I guess, when Bitcoin was first launched with the Genesis block to today, there were periods pretty much through the entire journey of manias and overhyped visions and just lots of insanity, tons of fraud, all kinds of bad stuff. And we saw a peak in 2017 when you had thousands of these ICOs that were really like not based on anything. They were really just sort of vaporware being sold to unsuspecting investors. And even today in the crypto space, it still feels like it's mostly that. Like, it's just mostly lots of cons that are being put on people. But I think the difference is over the last year or so, I've seen the first signs of kind of reality of like actual value creating tools being built, in particular in the DeFi space, that are valuable, useful, that have an actual sort of practical application, mostly in displacing a lot of the traditional finance infrastructure. And the motivation, sort of the reason I think for driving is because traditional finance just didn't want to touch and doesn't want to touch crypto with a 10-foot pole. And so DeFi kind of had to spring into existence to supply these tools around lending, investing, insurance, all these different tools to people in the crypto space. And I think that is going to be sort of the wedge that allows large chunks of the traditional finance infrastructure to start shifting over to DeFi. And DeFi, which is, by the way, DeFi, decentralized finance, built, which are basically many of the tools that traditional finance has, like lending, borrowing, financial derivatives, insurance, analytics in some ways, being built on this decentralized blockchain. And I think today the DeFi space is relatively small. It's on the order of tens of billions of dollars, which that sounds like a large number, but I mean the entire financial sector is trillions of dollars. So to me, it's not hard to imagine that this is a space that's going to be growing 1,000% a year for at least the next 1 or 2 years, and then continuing to grow at an insane clip after that. So anytime you have a market that's expanding that quickly and real value, again, probably 90% of it is speculation and not real value, but real value is being created there. That's an exciting place to be. I mean, it's hard to miss when you're in a space like that and you broadly look at the companies and tools that are being built and just invest in the ones that look like they're really adding value.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you sharing, your passion for this hobby of yours on the side. It's incredible to think about how it took 100 years or more for traditional finance to get all their tools and all their product offerings in place because of probably a lot of mistakes and inefficiencies in the system that they had to come up with a lot of these derivatives and insurance plays and things like that. But the DeFi space is built on a fundamental framework, an infrastructure that is, hundreds of times faster and more efficient and more costly than traditional finance. And then they can just mirror and copy all the other different product offerings that traditional finance offers and then layer that on top. Mm-hmm. And they're just going to be so much farther ahead because of what it is built on top of, which is, Ethereum blockchain and whatever kind of protocol you want to think about. But there's just that sort of starting point, which is going to accelerate them much farther. And you're right, tens of billions sounds like a lot of money, but compared to the trillions that we've been using in our traditional finance worlds for hundreds of years, it's going to happen very quickly compared to the way it took traditional finance to get to where they are today. So thank you for sharing that. Last thing we do before we always wrap up our show is we ask our guests for any book recommendations that you want to share with the audience that have been either influential or ones that you've read recently that you just want to share with the audience to give a read as well.
Other people have mentioned this book, but I'm a huge fan of Anti-Fragile. I mean, that's a book that had a pretty big influence on me. It's a continuation in the series by Nassim Taleb. And actually recently he published another book called Skin in the Game. All of those are sort of built on a lot of the core ideas in Fooled by Randomness and then The Black Swan. So that whole series is incredibly powerful. I guess it gives sort of a powerful conceptual framework in understanding, a lot of the events in the world.
Awesome. I haven't read that one. I definitely want to check it out, but I obviously know of the author, very well known. So thank you so much for joining us today in the tank, Mike. I really appreciate you sharing the real honest truth about building and scaling a startup with Mike Silagadze, founder of TopHat and Ripple Ventures venture partner. Thanks for joining us, Mike.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks for listening. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast. And make sure to give me a follow on Twitter or Clubhouse if you want to be in the audience and ask a question on our next Tank Talk. Till next time.